how much should I compromise in finding a job? My concern is that if I compromise too much, that I'll be unhappy. But I don't want to be impractical either and reject something that is good enough. In choosing anything, clarity is an important first step. To the extent that you can hold some sort of a mental image or write down or project in some way what it is you're actually looking for, that will make it easier to find it. It kind of sounds obvious when you say it out loud like that, but we often forget to do that. Maybe thinking of what we don't want, or we're looking at what's there. But stopping and asking that question, what do I actually want? What will be at least the ideal scenario? And it doesn't necessarily mean that you have to have every bit of that fleshed out. Some parts of it can be silhouettes. They can be rough sketches to some degree. But there probably is a reasonable sense of what you don't want, and at least a reasonable instinct as to what you do want. And that can be very formative and very useful as a starting point. So if you've got some sense of clarity on what you want from the role, then you can look to try and find some of the better fits for that. And a useful thing to do here is just to reflect back on previous experience that you have. So it might be in other jobs, other similar roles, or if you haven't had much work history, it can just be in other areas in your life. You're going to have clues from your studies, you're going to have clues from just your interests, the skills that you have, the things you've spent time doing. It can be from sports, it can be from art, it can be from physical fitness, it can be from your own personal development. And all of that, clues tend to be left around what kind of a person you are, what is at least a reasonable fit for you, and what probably isn't. Now, there's a distinction to be made between, it's not just that what you want to do is find what you absolutely love and just try and do that constantly. Sometimes we do need to grow a bit in other areas. So there can be areas that are still areas that we have some capacity in and that we potentially could feel more comfortable in, but just there's maybe a bit of stretching that needs to be done there. Whereas there are things outside of it which are just not us, and there's really no point in trying to force ourselves into the mold of something that's never going to be a fit. So if you reflect, it tends to be reasonably clear what these things are. Maybe not completely clear. You probably need to practice around with it a bit to see. But sometimes we know that there is something that could actually really develop us in terms of our professional development. And we kind of know that in principle we probably would like it, but we're just resisting it for whatever reason. Maybe we haven't built some mental muscle tone in that area, but if we were to commit a bit more, we could and we should do that. Whereas, again, maybe there's other areas that are completely outside of the mix, and we still might need some familiarity with those things, but you don't need to specialize in everything. You can't be expected to be the most academic person and the most physically accomplished person, and then you're the most musical person, and there's a lot of areas that you could choose to grow in. So to some degree you can diversify, but you can also kind of choose your central specializations based on your interests and based on your skills. So with some degree of clarity there, then the question becomes, what is the least worst option available on the marketplace? And it may be that you're going a self-employed route, and so the least worst option there is some kind of form or model of business that you can use and develop. Or it may be that you're looking to be hired, or maybe kind of consultancy roles, or it could be something else. So you can be reasonably open to that. And nowadays there are a number of models, I suppose, for how you can use your skills in a meaningful way. So it can be helpful to reflect on that. And even if you are going for a kind of a classic a job where you're being employed and working set hours and being paid for that, rather than something self-employed or starting your own business, even then, still considering what it would be to do consultancy work in the area you have skill in or set up a business, that's actually a really useful exercise either way. Because what it helps you do is develop a confidence in recognizing your skills independently. And then when you take on a given job, you work with a company, it's not so much a feeling of a loss of your identity there. You're hopefully going to the interview and getting into the job with an attitude of recognizing some of the skills you have and actually feeling excited about using them in a way that will help the company or the company's colleagues or the company's clients in some sort of a positive and meaningful way. So it's a nice self-development exercise anyway, regardless of what path you're going down. But the least worst option, I think, is what we're looking for. You, of course, in many cases can upgrade as you go. You know, it's not in most types of work. There are probably some exceptions, but in most types of work, you're not just stuck in it forever and that's it. You know, tough. You can do it and you can change it and you can move beyond it. And of course, if there is anything that's very contractual and you're not sure, do investigate that first. See if you can trial it, speak to other people who do it, investigate it and satisfy yourself in smaller ways that it is a fit before you commit in that way. The other example is whether there's contractual commitments or not, but if there's just training requirements first, you're not going to want to invest all that energy and maybe money and definitely time into that if it really isn't going to be a fit for you down the road. It needs to be at least reasonable certainty that it is. So again, taste it first, try it, and make sure it is a reasonably good match for you. So assuming you have some flexibility to upgrade as you go, getting started with something is generally a good idea, even if it isn't quite a great fit. Of course, out of all the options available, definitely look for the least worst options. There's no reason to look for bad options. And the point about the least worst option idea is that it doesn't need to be perfect. It definitely doesn't. But you're still at the same time recognizing what your most important values are and maybe having a few lines that you don't want to cross. So if you really want a role to be a bit more social, you just know that you don't work well by yourself or things like that. You know that there's certain issues maybe with working hours or times of day or shifts or whatever it might be. That clarity can help you recognize and filter then some of the roles available. It's not just how many of your values it meets or how compatible it is across the board. It's also weighting your values and the things that matter to you most, because there might be some of them that you could actually have 3 or 4 things that aren't a fit, but they don't matter that much, those things. Whereas you could have one thing that's actually really important, and if it doesn't fulfill that criteria, it's not really going to be a fit, and you're probably not going to enjoy it or then do well in the role, which is going to lead to, further problems down the road. So if you can, to some degree, and I emphasize that this doesn't need to be perfect, it can be casual, it can be flexible, but if you, to some degree, can do a bit of reflective work around that, what are you good at? What are your passions? What have you learned from previous roles you've been in? That hopefully will give you some clues as to what you're looking for in the role that you're applying for, and then you can find the least worst option that's available, and from that keep exploring. Look to move forward either within the company or the organization, or to leave it and go other places. You can be quite open about that, but the goal is to be able to use your capacities in ways that fulfill you and actually then help other people, and that in turn will fulfill you as well, because you'll feel that there's some meaning to what you're doing. If you have a role, and this is probably true to some degree of all roles, different degrees granted, but it's true to some degree of all roles, I think, if there's needs that aren't being met in the role, I think a key thing to do here is consider how you can meet those needs in other ways, how you can address them in some other shape or form, because it could be that you're considering jobs and there is a job that's rather attractive for a number of reasons, but maybe there are 2 or 3 issues with it that it isn't that good a fit. But it may be that outside of the work you can meet those needs in other ways. So you can have hobbies or interests, or you can be volunteering, or you can be studying or learning in that area, or sometimes even other work in that area, or even running a business, but as a smaller project. Sometimes that is possible alongside a job, and sometimes it's appropriate and it's compatible. So whatever your strategy is for achieving it, it is true that you're probably going to want to meet some of those fundamental needs you have fairly holistically. And it doesn't mean they all need to be met immediately, but particularly over the course of time, if you're not meeting some of those needs, it might be a problem, because that leads then to resentment. It leads to a lack of fulfillment in the role. Whereas if you are getting that almost that nutrition from other sources, well, then you could carry on maybe the work you're doing and you would actually feel more satisfied in it. So that's the consideration, I think. Be holistic. As long as it adds up, you'll be reasonably okay. Of course, where possible, if you can have more nutrients in one source, that's great. If you have a workplace that's fulfilling you on so many levels, well, why not? And if that doesn't exist, well, it might exist down the road. There's a lot of industries and businesses and cultures that exist today that didn't exist a few years back. And whether it's about to be created or not, maybe you can be the person who actually creates it, either by setting it up or at least by highlighting the demand for it so that we do go down that road. If you found this valuable, do like, subscribe, and share. And what's your experience? Do you have any questions or topic suggestions? You can contribute in the comments, on social media using #bodymindself, or on jfl.com.